Renly Baratheon stood beneath the high walls of Storm's End, cloak of vibrant green twisting in the sea wind. The battlements loomed overhead, ancient and unyielding, just as they had stood fast for centuries under the watch of House Baratheon. Rain pattered against the stones, and dim gray clouds churned in the evening sky, threatening a storm the likes of which even the Stormlands rarely saw. But Renly felt no fear, only a near-thrumming energy of anticipation. His brother Stannis was encamped beyond the horizon, out of sight, but certainly not out of mind. He remembered the rumors well enough. Stannis had conjured some dark magic with that red priestess by his side. Men whispered that shadows walked in Stannis's camp, conjured by the Lady Melisandre to do his bidding. Renly had nearly brushed off such ghost stories, but after what had happened to Courtenay Penrose, after the mounting fear in men's voices, a thread of doubt tugged at him. Even so, he was Renly Baratheon, and he would not falter before shadows. The realm needed a king who could unite, not one who hid behind forbidding walls or practiced foul sorceries. And he was certain that, if given a real chance to stand opposed on a field of battle, his younger, more vibrant forces would overcome the austere forces of Stannis. Knights from the Reach, men of the Stormlands, they had come to Renly for his charm and his promise of a brighter future. There was more than enough faith in that to bring Stannis down. The siege had begun in earnest some days ago, but Renly chose to delay direct confrontation. He wanted to ensure the loyalty of every single banner who came to fight for him. Some from the Stormlands were uncertain which brother to support. Others from the Reach believed any immediate battle would end in bloodshed for all. Still, the time for caution was wearing thin. Every day they waited, Stannis's ominous presence weighed heavier. Most of all, Renly's new bride, Margaery Tyrell, needed to see her husband triumphant, to witness that he was no mere puppet of the Tyrells but a rightful king of his own making. So, he had set the date for battle, and as the hour approached, every heart in the castle felt that hush of expectation. When the horns finally sounded, dawn had only just crept over the horizon. The Sea of Dorne was roiling with whitecaps, and a bitter wind swept across the fields. The banners of House Tyrell, bright gold roses on a field of green, snapped and crackled in the breeze. Renly's own crowned stag soared beside them, a proud reminder of the might of Storm's End. Knights were rousing from their tents, adjusting armor, muttering prayers. The lords of the Reach formed up their lines carefully. Shimmering steel in the morning light, the luster of gold filigree on expensive helms, plumes of soft feathers dipping and swaying. They looked more like a parade than an army bound for war, but beneath all that finery was determination. On the far ridge, Stannis's troops stood in dark contrast. They wore plain steel and mail, practical attire for soldiers who fought not for glory but out of duty. Battle standards drooped in the wind, banners bearing the fiery heart, a new sigil for the Lord who had embraced the Lord of Light. From a distance, their ranks were an unwavering gray line. If Renly felt any sympathy for his older brother, he tucked it away. The realm could not serve two kings. There had to be one victor, and victory today would belong to him. The thunderous roll of war drums began to echo across the field. In the center of his force, Renly led the vanguard himself, flanked by Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, resplendent in gilded armor shaped with delicate floral motifs. Beside them rode other knights of the Reach, some smiling in the face of the oncoming storm, others steeling themselves for the carnage to come. From behind, they all heard the roar of the Tyrell cavalry, fierce men on tall destriers, thrumming with readiness. Renly swallowed a lump in his throat. He could almost hear the heartbeats of the men around him. Soon, the horns would call them forward, and once set in motion, there would be no turning back. Stannis commanded his troops from the right flank, expression grim beneath the black stag crown he wore. The Red Priestess, Melisandre, was nowhere in sight, though doubtless she lurked somewhere, weaving her illusions. Renly had no illusions of his own. He had the steel of thousands who believed in him. As his own hornblowers signaled the charge, the ground shook with hooves pounding. Mud splashed up in filthy arcs, coating men's boots and horses' flanks. The Knight of Flowers surged ahead, urging his mount to full gallop. Squires carrying the banners followed, and in moments, a giant wave of color, steel, and fearless momentum thundered towards Stannis' lines. Stannis' men did not break. His front ranks braced themselves, spears at the ready, crossbowmen stepping up to loose their bolts. The first volley whistled through the air, catching men and horses alike. Screams intermingled with the clang of steel, but the charge did not falter. Renly's cavalry crashed into the shield wall. For a flash, it was a frenetic blur of swords, pikes, shrieks, and the heady metallic tang of blood. Renly found himself locked in a swirl of violence, parrying a spear thrust here, swiping at an oncoming soldier there. Knights at his flanks advanced methodically, forcing Stannis' men to give ground with each formation push. Time became a strange thing, measured not in minutes but in how many bodies fell or how far the line shifted. Renly lost sight of Loras amid the melee. He pressed forward, half-blind with swirling mud, raising his sword at anything that threatened him. A crossbow bolt struck the breastplate of the knight beside him, pitching the man backward in his saddle. Renly spurred his horse on, weaving through the chaotic churn, passing pockets of men from both sides who had dismounted to fight hand to hand. He glimpsed to the left and saw a banner of golden roses toppling into the mud, only for a second standard-bearer to seize it, thrust it back up, and continue the attack. That was the spirit that would claim the day, he told himself. That unstoppable force of the Reach combined with the steadfast hearts of the Stormlands. Their left flank advanced the fastest, driving a wedge into Stannis' side. But the right flank on Renly's side began to falter. He'd stationed lords there who were less experienced, less loyal. Word from that side was that Stannis himself had joined the fray, stoic and relentless. Renly knew that if he wanted to break his brother's army, he had to strike at its heart. With a resolute set of his jaw, he maneuvered his horse toward the thick of the fight on the right, determined to face Stannis before the day's end. Perhaps half an hour later, though it felt like a brutal eternity, the two Baratheon brothers finally came within sight of each other. The pitched battle parted around them as men recognized the confrontation. Rain was driving harder now, plastering Renly's dark hair to his forehead, streaming into his eyes. Stannis, older, face etched with years of stone-hard determination, watched him from behind his visor. Neither spoke at first. The thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, the thrum of crossbows, these were their conversation. For a moment, Renly saw in Stannis not a bitter rival but a man burdened by a sense of duty so deep that it had twisted him into sternness. In another lifetime, they might have stood side by side. But in this lifetime, only one of them could claim the Baratheon crown. Stannis raised his sword, an unspoken challenge. Renly nodded, accepting. Their horses circled, each searching for an opening. Lightning forked across the sky, and in that violent glow, they charged. Their blades met with a resounding clang, sparks dancing. Renly's muscles strained as he tried to force Stannis' blade aside. His brother was wiry, strong despite his lean frame, and he held his own with grim tenacity. Their horses jostled in the mud, hooves sliding, and both men angled to keep balance. Renly lunged, but Stannis parried and sliced at Renly's thigh. The armor prevented a lethal wound, but pain shot through Renly's leg. He gritted his teeth and struck back. Again and again, they traded blows, neither quite able to overpower the other. The mud was treacherous, and their steeds whinnied in distress. Onlookers gasped as the two battered each other, armor denting, rain-lashed hair whipping about. For years, their animosity had simmered, overshadowed by Robert's boisterous presence. Now all those old resentments, the sibling rancor, the sense of being overshadowed or undermined, flared in every strike. At last, Renly found an opening. Stannis was momentarily unbalanced by a step in the mud, his horse's hoof slipping. Renly slammed his sword against Stannis' blade, sending a jarring shock up his brother's arm. And in that fraction of a heartbeat, Stannis' guard faltered. Renly wrenched sideways and brought his blade crashing down on Stannis' shoulder with all his might. Stannis cried out, the sound torn away by the howling wind. The older brother slumped in his saddle, sword dangling from numbed fingers. His horse neighed and stumbled. Renly moved in for the final blow, hesitated only for a half-breath, a pang of guilt staying his hand, then struck, piercing armor and flesh. Stannis toppled from his horse, the wet ground accepting him with a sickening thud. The swirl of battle slowed, paused in pockets, as men saw their lord and commander lying motionless in the rain. A hush fell, like the hush of the grave, but only for seconds. Then a roar started from the throats of Renly's men, raw triumph and disbelief. They had won. Stannis Baratheon was dead. Amidst the torrent of rain, Renly reined in his trembling horse and dismounted, nearly sinking to his knees in the mud. He felt oddly detached, searching Stannis's pale face for any sign of life. The older man's eyes were open, staring at the sky as if it held some final revelation. Blood mingled with rain, turning pink rivulets that trickled down the slope. A wave of exhaustion crashed into Renly. He had slain his own brother. For years, he had convinced himself it might come to that Stannis would never yield and the crown was worth everything. But now, in the stillness after the fight, the cost weighed on his chest. No victory horn or enemy shout broke the moment. Men from the Reach parted around the site as though it were a black hole, devouring any sense of relief or celebration. Loras Tyrell found Renly then, grabbing his elbow and helping him back to his feet. Neither man said a word, but the sorrow in Loras's eyes said enough. Stannis' soldiers were dropping their weapons, disheartened at the death of their commander. Some tried to flee, but the encirclement by the cavalry made escape nearly impossible. Others simply sank to their knees, gazes distant, as though everything had been taken from them in one final stroke. For a moment, the field was a place of eerie calm, broken only by the quiet sobs of dying men, the shuffle of feet through mud, and the soft rustle of banners in the wind. When Renly finally found his voice, he ordered mercy for those who surrendered. He had no wish to slaughter fatherless sons and brotherless men on this day of all days. The Red Priestess Melisandre was nowhere to be found, and rumors later spoke of her vanishing in a swirl of scarlet cloth before the battle's end. Some said she had conjured something to turn the tide, only to be thwarted by the fervor of Renly's charge. Others thought she had simply fled, her champion gone. Renly could spare no thought for her at that moment. He could only muster enough will to order his lords to gather the captured knights and men-at-arms, to see to the wounded, and to prepare to march on new challenges ahead. They bore Stannis' body into Storm's End, covering him with a cloak embroidered with the sigil of House Baratheon. He was, after all, still a Baratheon, Renly's own blood, and the Stormlands would see him honored, not tossed in a ditch. The castle halls were quiet despite the large number of men passing through them. Gravity clung to the air, a sense that something momentous had occurred that could not be undone. Even the newly arrived lords from the Reach spoke in hushed tones. Renly retreated to his solar as soon as he could, to wash away the blood and shame. Loras followed close behind, ready to offer comfort but at a loss for words. The newly made king of the Stormlands, now the victor in a civil war between brothers, found no solace in the knowledge that he had won. In the days that followed, messages flew across the realm. Some alliances hung in the balance. In the Westerlands, the Lannisters had crowned Joffrey, bastardy aside, trying to maintain a hold on King's Landing. Robb Stark had declared himself king in the north. Balon Greyjoy was said to style himself king of the Isles and the north as well. But the Tyrells had thrown in their lot with Renly, and with Mace Tyrell's deep coffers and the Stormlands' strategic position, King's Landing looked precarious. Yet no one had expected Stannis' defeat to come so swiftly. The effect was immediate and galvanizing. Many lords who had wavered between the Baratheon brothers now turned to Renly in droves. Renly's court formed quickly at Storm's End. He gave daily audiences in the Grand Hall, perched upon a hastily built wooden seat meant to evoke the Iron Throne. Jokes abounded behind his back about a wooden throne for the wooden sword, but few dared voice such barbs openly. The Great Hall was filled with Tyrell bannermen seeking new charters and Stormland lords petitioning for their slice of favor. Knightly squires drifted about, excited to be in the presence of a triumphant king. It was a heady rush for most, but for Renly it felt hollow. He found himself sitting through tedious discussions of distribution of lands, garrison placements, the granting of minor lordships to secure loyalty. He tried to smile and project an image of magnanimity, but inside, a question loomed. Had he done the right thing by seeking the crown? One evening, Renly visited Stannis' body, laid out in the small sept within Storm's End's walls. He excused the silent septas who kept watch with candles and asked them to leave him alone. Reverently, he knelt by the simple bier. Stannis' face was still etched with the severity he had worn in life, though the lines seemed softer now. "I had no choice," Renly whispered, and though the dead could not answer, he felt the weight of Stannis' silent reproach. In the flickering candlelight, shadows danced on the walls, reminding him of the tales men told about Melisandre's powers. He had turned a blind eye to them, preferring to rely on the strength of arms. Now, he wondered how close that shadowy magic had come to ending him in turn. How miraculous it was that he had survived unscathed. Perhaps some higher power or simpler chance had tilted fate in his favor. Or perhaps Stannis, for all his talk of destiny, had not been destined at all. When Renly rose, he found Margaery Tyrell waiting for him outside the September. She wore a gown of pale green velvet, a gold sash cinched around her slim waist, her hair arranged in an elegant fall that framed her face. She reached out and touched his arm gently, concern evident in her brown eyes. "My lord husband," she said, voice soft, "would that your brother had yielded. But I trust you know we stand by you now. My father and my brother Willis are seeing to the lords in the courtyard. The crown, your crown, must press forward." Renly managed a tight smile. He did not want to burden her with his grief. Though their marriage was political, they were forging a companionship in their own quiet ways. "You are a comfort, Margaery," he said, placing his hand atop hers. "I hope the realm will see a time of peace soon. Too much blood has been spilled already." She nodded, glancing at the closed door of the September. "I share that wish. But while others vie for the throne, we have no choice but to be strong. So, be strong," he told himself. He was the last Baratheon brother left standing, for Joffrey was not truly a Baratheon at all. That made him the rightful heir of Robert Baratheon. Did it not? He would gather his forces, march on King's Landing, and unseat the Lannisters. And after that, perhaps he could mend the fractures in the realm, if not by personal warmth, then by ensuring a just peace. Margaery's presence anchored him. He felt his resolve settle. Over the next weeks, Storm's End teemed with activity. Tyrell bannermen arrived with companies of soldiers, wagons of supplies, and oaths of fealty. The Stormlanders who had joined Stannis were gradually pardoned, so long as they bent the knee to Renly. Some refused and were cast into dungeons or else exiled. Others, fearful of losing everything, swore new allegiance. Rumors spread that Renly would soon make a decisive move on King's Landing, counting on the Tyrell might to break the Lannister hold on the capital. Meanwhile, the northern conflict simmered, with Robb Stark's successes putting pressure on the Lannisters from that quarter. People whispered that the Lannisters could not hold out if the Tyrells and the king in the north coordinated, but such an alliance seemed as unlikely as it was untested. Renly began to plan. He called frequent councils, assembling the best minds of both the Reach and the Stormlands. Loras Tyrell was ever present, wearing the green cloak of the Kingsguard that Renly created in an attempt to emulate the storied legacy of Aegon's Kingsguard. The seats of council were also filled by wise lords from the Reach: Randall Tarley, Garland Tyrell, Mathis Rowan, and a host of others. From the Stormlands came old, hawk-eyed lords like Bryce Caron and the Penroses who still remained loyal. They debated strategy over long wooden tables strewn with maps of the Crownlands and the roads to King's Landing. An immediate siege was suggested by some. Others cautioned that they should starve out the city, applying pressure slowly so as not to rouse the dragon's teeth of Tywin Lannister's army. Renly had always been at home in the company of others, easily winning men to his side with his charm. But the burden of kingship turned these councils into a constant, draining performance. He had to appear decisive, benevolent, and confident all at once. As he learned more about the complexities of supply lines, the dangers of rash advances, the cunning of Tywin Lannister, he realized how little he knew about truly ruling. Robert had hammered out rebellions with a mighty warhammer, but the art of kingship was a subtler craft. More than once, Renly felt gratitude that Marjorie's father, Mace Tyrell, possessed a certain straightforward ambition. The man yearned for the glory of seeing his daughter on the Iron Throne as queen, and his house rose in standing with every day Renly reigned. So, Mace was inclined to lend every resource possible to keep Renly's campaign afloat.